In 1945, Royal Air Force Corporal Thomas North was stationed in Burma, working in the 3rd Repair and Salvage Unit on the front lines. At 21 years old, he carried with him a travel chess set made from painted bits of plastic, various Japanese souvenirs and photographs, and a women's auxiliary Air Force doll knitted for him by his sister and mother. These items and others were donated to the Second World War Experience Center by Beatrice North, his widow. The doll carried by Mr. North is not only a prime example of a scrap-consuming, wartime make-do-and-mend pattern, but also shows patriotism in a more lighthearted way in a time when most things were made or done out of necessity, and many luxuries had to be done without. It was actually part of a collection released by Bestway of Navy, infantry, and Air Force dolls and their respective female counterparts, also published by Australian Women's Weekly, where I happened to find the pattern. Extant examples of these dolls can be found on the internet, unlike a lot of other vintage knitting patterns, which I think goes to show how valuable morale boosting was at the time, both on the home front and abroad. With that bit of history out of the way, if you'd like to follow along with me, I'll link the digital download that I purchased below, as well as a free version of the Bestway pattern that I found. I believe they're the same, unless there are differences between the Australian and British Air Force uniforms, but the paid version does have a much clearer picture. So next I'm going to be starting my 1940s doll pattern. They call for a couple colors, as you can see here. The first is Air Force Blue. That's just like a really true nice blue color. I don't happen to have that in my stash, and I really didn't want to buy any more yarn for this project. So I'll be using this worsted weight wool. It's a bit dark, but I think it's a very pretty color and it complements the skin tone and the other colors very well, so I'll just go with this one. If you'll notice, it's a worsted weight yarn, which is quite thick. They call for a 4-ply, which I just looked it up. It's a vintage term for fingering weight. I figured what I'd try to do is pull apart the yarn and only use one strand of the 3. It's a little bit brittle, but hopefully it'll hold up once I start knitting it. Second color they call for is black. Pretty basic. This is just like a light worsted weight that I have in my stash. Need a very small amount of it. And I'm going to be splitting this into 2 to create a similar width to the blue yarn that I just showed you. Next color is gray, that they're using to simulate the stockings, but I'm not sure how well that illusion will get pulled off in yarn, and it may just look off to a modern eye because, you know, we're used to people not wearing stockings very often, and so I'll just be going with the skin color. We'll also need some pale blue for the shirt, very small amount, and again, skin color for the skin. I'll be splitting this to be smaller just like the other ones. Need some brown for the hair, and a little bit of yellow and red. I believe the red is for the tie, and the yellow is to embroider on some buttons. And we'll be knitting it all on number 12 knitting needles. So that's 2.25 millimeters. I have 2 millimeters here and 2.5 millimeters here. I think I'm going to go with the 2 millimeter because I'm currently working on another sweater with a 2.5 and not sure how long this is going to take. So I may want to work simultaneously on them. So yeah, let's get started on the feet. So I've just begun casting on my 4 stitches. It's crazy to work this small. I've never made anything like this before. I mean, like, I'm not really that advanced at knitting. I've only made a couple of things, mostly like sweaters and things and hats. Okay, there's our first row finished. We're gonna do a couple more rows of increases. As you can see now, I have 5 stitches before I had 4. So we've increased a little bit. Now we're just going to work as normal for a couple rows. So it may be obvious the way I'm knitting, but I'm quite new to it. I've only been doing it for about a year and haven't been doing it a ton. So I've made 1 sweater and I didn't like how it came out. I've started the second, but it's quite slow going. I hope to get better at knitting because you can't really crochet vintage sweaters. I mean, like, some patterns do exist, but they're really not as nice as the knitted ones. Crochet, I've been doing it for a good many years, so I consider myself to be quite good at it, but I think knitting is, at least for clothing, is a bit more practical of a skill. Don't get me wrong, I still absolutely love crochet. These days I've been making a lot of lace, but, you know, occasionally I still do amigurumi and stuff like that. Great for gifts. So this is what our piece looks like so far. Really tiny. Let's see what the next step is. So now we're going to decrease twice in the middle of this row, and then in 2 rows from now, we're going to increase in the middle of the row. So yeah, I'll see you when I've finished this foot, because after those next 2 rows, then we're on to the legs. Okay, so we finished the foot. It's kind of like this sort of cupped shape with the increases and decreases in the middle. I have no idea how this is going to form into a foot shape, but I'm just going to trust. So next what we're going to do is start on the legs. So basically I'm just going to knit a bunch of rows upwards in the skin tone. I guess I could also use this as an opportunity to show you how I've been splitting the yarn. First I decide how many strands to use. I think I'll use 2, just like with the other one. So now we've split the very end, and as we pull it's just going to split on its own, except if we just pull it like this without letting it twist the other way, it's just going to end up as a massive mess. So what I've been doing is taking a hairpin and pinning the end of the yarn to the skein, like so, to keep it from moving. And then I take the 2 ends in my fingers and I let the skein dangle and spin as I just hold on to the ends of the yarn. And that lets it unwind without tangling all over the place. And I'm going to take one of the ends and wrap it around just a random piece of paper so that I could save it for later use and keep it all neat. Okay, so I've worked my 48 rows. As you can see, this is what it looks like. The legs look kind of long, but I'm just going to trust. I guess this stall is just like a lot larger than I thought it was. Next, we're going to move on to the next leg, which we'll probably do mostly off camera. But to save these stitches, what we're going to do is we're going to put them onto a safety pin, which I think is the cutest idea ever. Mad props to whoever in the 40s thought of that one. And it fits the stitches absolutely perfectly. So there we have it, our first leg. So I've completed my second leg, here it is. And the next step is to work across both leg stitches with the Air Force Blue. Here I've broken up my worsted weight wool into 3. It's actually a little bit thinner than what I was just using. So if I can't make this work, it won't be the end of the world if I have to use the 2-ply stuff that I pulled away from this. Now we're going to cast on 1 for the space in between the legs. And now we can transfer these other leg stitches onto our other knitting needle. And now I'm just going to purl across the other leg. Now I'm just going to work a bunch of rows upwards, so I'll see you when I'm done with that. So I've worked all of the rows onto here, and I've just transferred this onto a spare needle so that I could start on the skirt, which I've just cast on. I've just worked my first 3 rows, and they wanted me to knit 3 rows working into the backs of the stitches of the first row. I didn't really know what that meant, so I just knitted the 3 rows, and that's probably to counteract the curling of the fabric maybe? So yeah, now I'm going to work a bunch of rows upwards and then start on the shaping at the hips. Okay, so it's been a couple of days since I've spoken to you, and in the meantime I've knitted up the skirt. As you can see, it's a bunch of rows knitted straight, and then a couple of decrease rows interspersed with just straight rows for like a 1940s A-line skirt. As I explained to you in a bit more detail how I did it, I'll be transferring the stitches onto my spare needle. So as I continued to unwind the yarn, some of the single strands ended up being really thin, and so there are a couple of stitches in here that are rather sparse and not the strongest. Since this isn't like a real garment, I don't think that's going to be a problem as long as I don't put a ton of stress onto it. Like in some of these really sparse areas, the length of the fiber that gets pulled when I pull the fabric is so small that it's most likely not going to tear. And so yeah, that's what's going on with this skirt. So now we're going to start on the tunic. So I've just worked a little garter stitch edge to create this sort of texture that kind of looks like pearls on both sides a little bit. So now we're going to purl all the way across except for the last 2 stitches, which we're going to knit, and then in the row after that we're going to knit all the way across, so just stockinette, and knit these last 2 stitches together. Okay, so I finished the tunic piece and I read ahead a little bit in the pattern to figure out kind of what this is. As you can see, her jacket's got a peplum, And so this piece is one of those peplum pieces. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a mirror image of that for the other side and knit them together overlapping and then continue with the body. But as you can see, it's got the garter stitch around the base and the side. I'm going to go ahead and create a mirror image of this for the other side, and then we're going to knit them together. So the first thing we're going to do is knit across about half of this piece as normal. While I'm knitting these overlapping stitches, I don't know how I'm going to keep these stitches from unraveling. So I think I may use the safety pin that we used before for the feet. I think I'm going to get out a crochet hook and kind of just like brute force this. I'll take both stitches on my hook and just kind of fake the action of knitting. Yeah, okay, that worked. A little bit crude, but it works. Okay, I figured it out. So basically what I do is the stitches from the other piece go on one needle, just like a spare, and the stitches from this piece that I'm knitting right now go on the needle that I've been using. Basically what you do is you line them both up like this so that you could take one loop from the normal needle and then go through to the spare needle and pick up that loop as well. But what I end up with is a situation like this. Both loops that I'm trying to knit through are on this needle, yet they're also individually on the needles in which they came. I'm able to yarn over and carefully go through just like I would do if I was knitting regularly and remove both of those from their needles. So yeah, there we have our two pieces knitted together. Remember, these outside edges are going to be stitched into a side seam or something like that. And now we're just going to work across here for one row, and then we'll work on attaching this onto the leg piece that we were working on earlier. So I don't remember the last time I updated you. So basically what I've done is I've knitted the two tunic pieces onto the body, and so that's what the join looks like. And as you can see, it just flips down like that. And then from there, I've knitted up like 13 or so rows. Now we're going to start on the arms. So we're going to start at the hand, and since it's a long-sleeved suit, that's all we have to do in this skin color. Now I'm just going to work 2 rows in stockinette on these stitches. So I've switched to blue and have done a couple increases. And so now what I'm going to do is knit 25 rows for the sleeves. Okay, so I've made both of my arms, as you can see, and I've arranged them onto this needle so that the body is obviously in the middle, and the first half of the stitches on this arm are on a safety pin. So what we're going to do is we're going to knit across the arm, across the body, and then halfway across this arm, and then we'll give these stitches the same safety pin treatment. Going into this project, I thought there was going to be like a lot of sewing. Like I figured we were just going to knit a bunch of pattern pieces and sew them together, but most of the assembly is done while knitting. I feel like in crochet we really don't do that, so that's kind of new to me. I don't have another safety pin on me, so I'm just going to try and stuff these stitches into a stitch marker. Alright, now I'm just going to work 6 rows up from here. So I've knitted my couple rows up, and we're about to start knitting the little bit of the shirt that's peeking out of the collar. It originally calls for using blue, but I've since decided that the blue kind of feels like acrylic, and the stuff that I'm working with here is wool. This skin color yarn is also acrylic, but I have nothing else, and it's passable, but the blue really isn't. And so I decided I'm going to use this white instead. I don't have to pull it apart, which is good. It's the perfect weight as is, but I'm just going to knit across until I get to the center, and I'm just going to take the white and knit those 3 stitches in the middle. So now I'm just going to be continuing upwards, doing alternating rows of decreases and just maintaining the colors. And I'll be doing that once more and then casting off the shoulder. As you can see, we finished our body with these very square 1940 shoulders that we created by just casting off these stitches. What we're going to do now is knit 2 rows of white for the neck and then switch to the skin tone so that we can start working on the head. So to create the shape of the head, what I've been doing is knitting the middle stitches more than the outside stitches. So for example, for this next row that I'm going to be working, The instructions are to slip 1 and then purl 4. And then we turn. So as you can see, we've gotten further along in the middle than the outside. Slip 1 and knit 2. And I think we're making a nose now, maybe? I don't know. I'm just kind of blindly following their instructions and hoping that it does not lead me astray. So what I've done since I've last spoken to you is I've just worked a couple rows upwards from the chin. Pretty sure it's a chin now. And I did a little bit of increasing, maybe for the nose. So the instructions are to knit 7, skip 1, or slip 1, knit 2 together, and pass slipped stitch over. So maybe that's going to do something for our nose. So I guess that's nose-like. I don't know. The chin's quite exaggerated, so I figured the nose would be too, but it's not. Okay, so I've worked to the head. As you can see, it's got a small nose, very large chin, and a very large forehead. It's looking a little bit large compared to the body, probably because this yarn is just so much thicker than the single ply body weight. So I may just sew it up with a little bit less room in the forehead like that. Yes, hello. What we're going to do is make the bottom half of the shoes and add a heel, similarly to how we worked the chin. And then we're just going to work up with the other half of the legs and the body and connect it at the shoulders. So if anything interesting happens, I'll show you, but that's where we're looking now. If I recall correctly, it's been quite a while since I've last updated you guys. So basically what I've done is I've knitted the rest of the body, and I've just knitted on the arms as a continuation of the body, similarly to how we did to the front. And I believe the last thing I have to knit is the hat. So we're nearly finished. Alright, so to start the cap, what we're going to do is cast on 8 stitches. And now we're just going to do a couple rows of increasing. So increasing at both ends of the next 4 rows, and then increasing every other row for the next 5. And then we're going to work a couple rows straight, and then we're going to do the opposite. So decreasing for the alternate 5 rows, and then decreasing for 4 rows. Then it looks like we're going to cast off, and then do a crochet border, which is very interesting because at least nowadays I feel like they wouldn't include crochet on a knitting pattern just in case, you know, people don't know how to crochet. But I guess back in the 1940s both skills were pretty common, so you know, it was okay to do that. So we finished the hat. It's just like a circle that we're going to gather around the head and put like a crochet border around. Obviously, before we can do that, we have to sew up the doll to find out how large the head is. They give very minimal instructions. They just say, join seams of feet and stuff, then gradually complete all the seams of the body, stuffing the doll as the seams are made. And I'm going to stuff this doll with yarn scraps and fabric scraps and maybe a little bit of stuffing. So to just kind of clean up this area a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and cut off any excess long tails. Obviously not cutting off the whole thing because we don't want anything to unravel at this point. So I'm going to start sewing up by anchoring my thread into this foot piece. Begin stitching around the foot. Alright, I've stitched up both my feet. Now I'm just going to stuff them with some fabric scraps. You know, that actually doesn't look that bad. I was kind of afraid when the seams started coming out like a little bit lumpy, but it's actually pretty good. Now I'm just going to do the same thing with the legs, just stitching all the way up and then stuffing, probably with toy stuffing to make it a little bit narrower. So they didn't really provide any instruction with the skirt besides like just leave it on a spare needle. Like they never told me to cast off. So I just went ahead and did that and sewed up the seams. So I'm just going to slip on this skirt for placement. I do have a little bit of leeway as to how high up I want it to go so that I have like an accurate looking proportion of the legs. I actually think that's pretty good. Maybe a smidge higher. Yeah, I think that's good. All right, so I'm just going to flip up this tunic bit and pin the skirt into place right here, and then I'm going to whip stitch it on. Oh yeah, I've also sewed up the sides of the tunic here so that it forms like a full peplum. From now on, it's basically just like small finishing things. The first thing being tying some wool around the wrists to make them a little bit more separate from the sleeves. And I'll keep the tails pretty long so that I can hide them later. I think it would make a little bit more sense to do this in blue so that it would be like cuffs of the jacket, but I'm just going to follow their instructions and do it in the skin tone. I think I'll be skipping the shoelaces because I really don't think it needs them, and I don't want the yarn to start to fray and things over time with the bows. The next step is to wrap this blue yarn around the waist 10 times, and I think I'm going to use double ply instead of single for a little bit more strength. I think 10 times around the waist is a little bit much, so I'll keep it at this. I think that's around like 4 or 5. Now we're going to make all the details of pockets and things using stitches. I think I'll go back to the single ply wool for that. It may be a little bit difficult to sew with it without breaking the threads, but I really think that this 2-ply stuff is a little bit too thick. Alright, so I finished all of the details on the suit itself. So it's a little bit hard to see in person, but I think on camera it shows up. You could see I put lapel lines and pockets on the side here too. And I also did a little collar outline. And just for fun, they said to do a black tie, but I thought that was boring. So I decided to do a red tie, and I think it looks really nice with this blue wool. The only thing I don't really like about the pattern is that they didn't say to put white on the back of the neck here, and so there's kind of just like no shirt back here. So here it is. It's a little bit small. I'm just going to run a gathering thread along the edge and gather it down. So I'd like to show you guys how I've been making the hair. So the hairstyle that they instruct you to give it is like a short, practical military cut. So we're making these small curls like this. So basically what they want us to do that is take up a small stitch, wrap the yarn around the needle. My needle is a little bit thin for what I want, so I'll just be laying a knitting needle here as well so that when I wrap I get a slightly larger wrap. And I'm just going to wrap 5 to 10 times. Okay, now I can pull my needle through. And create this sort of stitch right here. The only thing is it's got like this bar across the bottom. I tried to fix that, couldn't do it, so I just kind of have to deal with it. And then we can just lay that wherever we want it and sew into the doll. And there you have it, this little round stitch for the hair. So yeah, with that, our doll is finished. I absolutely love how it came out. I think the embroidered details really tie it all together and make it look a lot neater. Although I wouldn't consider this a reproduction, I used quite a bit of acrylic yarn and modern aluminum needles. Not sure what was the most common metal back then. I do find it really cool how actual vintage dolls exist that were made more or less in the same way that I did. It's one thing to recreate an idealized fashion plate or follow a sewing pattern, but when you have an item serving as proof that you aren't creating things in a vacuum, that real people 80 years ago followed the same steps that you did, it makes it a bit more special. And it also humanizes the dolls that now reside in war museums or antique collections, when you know how they were made and can see their maker's decisions if they differ from the pattern, as most of them do. For example, this doll's arms were knitted in a different manner. I believe when they got to the underarms, the person decided to cast on stitches and knit them horizontally as opposed to vertically. They also used some sort of fur for the hair, maybe in animals of some sort, or wool roving. Didn't use the garter stitch to prevent curling of the hems, didn't add the shirt and tie, and knitted the peplum as written instead of modifying it to be one piece along the back as I did because I thought it made more sense. They also created the chin by ribbing the bottom of the head and sewed on a nose instead. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It's a bit different from what I usually do, but I thought it was really interesting and I wanted to share it. Feel free to subscribe. I usually do sock plushies and vintage sewing, and I'll see you in the next video.